CBS Young, and the Restless spoilers Monday full episode September 29, 2025. Genoa City had the peculiar habit of making small decisions feel like destiny, and in a place where family names opened doors and closed wounds, ripple effects moved faster than anyone expected. The city's pulse quickened as job notices, whispered reconciliations, and old rivalries began to rearrange the social map. Michael Baldwin's world, built on quiet legal ferocity and a moral code he'd worn like armor, suddenly threatened to crumble. Rumors circled about his losing the position that had defined him, whether through the slow squeeze of company politics or because someone higher up wanted to reconfigure the playing field, and Michael felt the cool edge of displacement for the first time in years. It was not just about a job, it was about identity. The Baldwin name meant something in Genoa City courtrooms, and Michael's sense of order had always been anchored in the belief that law mattered more than gamesmanship. Now, he faced the humiliating possibility that the rules were changing and that his role might be expendable. He rode home thinking of ethics memos and past victories, and yet nothing prepared him for how personal the fallout would become. Friends would be forced to choose sides, alliances would harden, and the city would watch how he responded when the ledger of justice tilted against him. That night, in a different corner of town softened by the warm glow of incandescent bulbs, Billy Abbott and Sally Spectra found themselves in a much more private kind of reckoning. After months of tension, misreading gestures, and the slow burn of second chances, their reunion at the jazz club felt like a small miracle to a people who had hurt one another, now orbiting back toward a fragile, mutual understanding. The club's music wrapped around them, and the clink of glasses felt ceremonial as Billy raised his drink. "To you, Sally," he said with a tenderness that surprised even him. "You opened my eyes." She smiled, wary and luminous, asking what came next. And he spoke with a quiet conviction about the future. Abbott Communications would get the lifeline it needed, but only if they acted together. It was not a transaction but a pact. He promised to speak to his father and secure the funding that could restore not only the company's finances but the feeling of purpose both of them craved. When Sally asked who would make the decisions, he told her plainly that she must let her taste, her vision, her courage. It was an invitation to partnership that asked for more than half measures. They danced in the slow, intimate way of people who had learned from mistakes, and when Billy whispered the question about when she would move in, Sally hedged, preferring caution. Yet the night ended with a tenderness that felt both irrevocable and precarious. They retreated to her room with memories and possibilities tangled between them. With Billy promising that if this was the last night she called that bed home, he wanted it to be unforgettable. Their lovemaking that evening was not a reckless abandon, it was a vow wrapped in vulnerability, a quiet attempt to reforge trust through touch. Afterwards, he murmured again that being aligned with her felt right, and she let herself believe in that possibility, careful and yearning at Onspec in Genoa City. The most sincere promises always came with the risk of betrayal. Meanwhile, the Abbott train of strategy and ambition pulled another piece of the city's board into motion. Cain, who had always been a man of calculated moves, sat across from Michael on a ride that felt less like a commute and more like a passage into dangerous territory. Cain's face, usually placid and guarded, had an edge Michael recognized from the faces Victor Newman wore when he'd been backed into an immovable position, men who had nothing left to lose and were ready to reshape the terrain. Michael probed gently for the truth. What ultimatum had Victor delivered? What demand had he placed upon Cain's shoulders that required betrayal or a moral pivot? Cain neither answered directly nor allowed the conversation to stay simple. Instead, he put the question back on Michael. Would he come aboard Cain's plan, or would he step off? It was a question disguised as loyalty test, a man's line in the sand. Michael wanted clarity. Did Cain truly intend to dismantle the companies at the heart of Genoa City's commerce? And if so, why? Cain's evasive charm could not hide the fact that he was positioned to change the rules, possibly destroy reputations, and he needed allies who would not flinch. Michael's response, measured and legalistic, was that he held to principles first. If Cain's plan threatened the livelihoods of innocents and the rule of law, he would resist. Cain stared at him with a mixture of pity and resolve. If loyalty meant being willing to risk everything for family advantage, could Michael afford to remain purely principled? The train's rhythm matched the cadence of their moral argument, and when they parted, it was clear the night had not solved anything. It had simply set the stage for a collision that would involve Victor and his merciless logic, Jack and his old rivalries, and the fragile humans stuck in between. The threads of these upheavals braided into the larger tapestry, already straining under the weight of other scandals. Mariah Copeland's half-memory of a pillow fight that might have ended a life, Tess's reckless bravery, Daniel Romalotti Jr.'s sudden, earnest decision to walk beside her as protector, Kyle's heart torn between Claire's improbable gentle redemption and Audra's incendiary pull. Summer's European exile added a ghost at the edge of every family dinner, an absence that throbbed like an unplayed note. Eden Baldwin's old memory flickered like an ancestor's portrait in the hall. First loves matter even when they're gone, because they teach us what we fear to become. Into that charged atmosphere came Billy and Sally's promise of rebuilding and Michael's fear of expulsion. City's equilibrium seemed perched on a thin ledge, and everyone who thought themselves steady now found themselves teetering. For Michael, the job scare made the decision about Cain more painful. It added texture to his refusal to be a pawn. He could not afford to lose his moral compass because the currency of his life was not simply a paycheck, it was credibility, legacy, a belief that law should be the leveling force in a place defined by raw power. If Cain had accepted Victor's terms, it meant the Newmans were willing to rewrite the rules entirely. Michael's protests were not naive, they were a warning shot to men who believed everything could be bought. He knew the cost of opposition would be steep, perhaps even solitary, but he also knew that standing down would be complicity in breaches that could wreck lives. If Victor's ultimatum demanded cannibalizing smaller companies, silencing competitors, or leveraging regulatory blind spots, Michael couldn't sign on without sleepwalking into moral rot. Cain's eyes never left him, and that silence was the admission that the choice Michael faced was existential for them both. Would he keep his legal oath as his true north, or would the pressures of his city force him to recalculate? The effect of Michael's struggle rippled out. In the Newman and Abbott orbit, conversations that had been polite at holiday dinners now carried knives. Jack Abbott listened to Billy's pleas to reinvest in Abbott Communications weighed the company's legacy, the Abbott name. The optics of putting trust into a venture led by a woman who had been burned by the business world and a man who had been burned by too many loyalties. Billy's request to restore funding was not simply a financial move, it was a bid to restore dignity and to stake a claim for media voice in a city where reputation equaled power. Jack's hesitation was the kind of old-guard caution that had kept the family until now, but the presence of Sally, ambitious and polished, an underdog who had learned to survive through reinvention, made the decision more than a ledger entry. It made it a vote for culture and content and for the fragile dream of two people trying to rebuild. Sally's reluctance to rush into moving in with Billy was emblematic. She wanted a partnership but with eyes wide open, wary of repeating mistakes where hearts and commerce collided. Yet the song in the jazz club promised a different rhythm than the boardrooms, and intimacy that could, if sustained, become a fortress against the storm. All the while, the danger that had stalked Mariah's shadowy night remained a constant undertow. Tess's investigative courage, bolstered by Daniel's presence, brought them closer to answers, but also into a dangerous orbit. If the stranger they suspected had lived, if he harbored reason enough to return and inflict pain, then Tess's steadiness and Daniel's good intentions could make them targets. The notion that someone might retaliate against Tessa Dewan Mariah compounded the stakes. It made every choice about hotel rooms and late-night coffee feel like a gamble with lives on the line. Mariah's guilt intensified each time she heard Daniel's name in the same breath as Tessa's, because protecting someone from the consequences of your own past was a burden that would eventually consume you. Daniel, for his part, felt vindicated in the role of protector, his guitar slung over his shoulder like an old identity, while new purpose drew him into sleepless nights and tense, whispered plans. Whether he would rise into the kind of hero that guillotine moments in Genoa City demanded, or whether he would be the tragic bystander whose courage cost him dearly, remained to be seen. The city watched, hungry for the first act of violence or redemption that would set the tenor for the weeks to come. Across dinner tables and in late-night corners, the families whispered and aligned. Victor's ultimatum to Cain, whatever shape it took, was a tilt of the board meant to reshape loyalties. If Victor's plan succeeded, companies would fall, careers would be annihilated, and the moral center of Genoa City would feel the tremor. For Billy and Sally, the Abbott injection was a lifeline that could make them a new power couple in an industry defined by who controlled narrative. For Michael, Losing his job was the crucible that would test whether he would preserve principle at the cost of everything he loved, or whether he would bend to protect those he could not afford to lose. For Tessa and Daniel, the investigation could bring them closer or tear them apart in the cruelest ways. For Kyle, whose heart still wore the map of Summer's absence and Claire's gentle insistence, the arrival of Audra's flame promised new temptation. Every family choice had a personal toll. In Genoa City the next morning, people made early calls and later decisions. Jack mulled over the Abbott funding request. Michael called an old mentor to explore legal options. Billy rehearsed talking points about rebuilding trust with Sally. And Cain waited with a man's patience, ready to move like a predator when the time came. Mariah paced alone and wondered whether the past would truly return to ruin everything she had fought so hard to protect. Tessa and Daniel packed the careful equipment of two amateur detective escroage, questions, and an ill-advised optimism that bravery could buy safety. Across town, Claire prepared for a quiet day, unaware that the ripples of other people's choices would soon reach even her doorstep. Eden remained a memory in the back pages of an old file, a reminder that first loves taught lessons that could never be wholly escaped. Summer, and Europe, sent a short, ambiguous message about Harrison that read like a promise and a lullaby: "I'm here, but not here." The city waited for the next move, because in Genoa City every conversation, every intimate dance, every ultimatum was a loaded die. The coming days would test loyalties and reveal whether love and law, tenderness and ambition, might coexist in the same heart, or whether, in a place that forgave and punished with equal fervor, someone would be forced to choose a side and bear the cost for the rest of their lives. The difference in Faccia skulls when near Claire versus Audra, Michael's steady moral line, Billy's hopeful surrender, Sally's guarded leap showed that decisions had already begun to align destinies. And in the spaces between those decisions, the city's true drama gathered like storm clouds, promising that when the thunder finally struck, no one would remain unchanged. Michael Baldwin had spent years carving out a place for himself in Genoa City's volatile power structure, but nothing unsettled him more than watching Cain Ashby drift further down a path that promised ruin. Their exchange carried the weight of unfinished wars and unspoken choices. Cain told him plainly that he didn't need to go this route, but Michael could see in his eyes that the decision had already been made. "I know the road you're on comes with a price," Michael pressed, refusing to soften the edges. "Who do you want to punish, and who are you trying to impress?" It was not accusation so much as a plea, but Cain dismissed the attempt with a cold realism, insisting Michael's questions misunderstood the inevitability of his goals. He told Michael he didn't want to stain his integrity, that Michael was a good man, and nothing in his schemes was designed to pull him down. That should have been reassuring, but it sounded more like a death sentence wrapped in courtesy. Michael fought harder, trying to steer him away from rash moves, insisting that cutting ties or cutting people off was unnecessary. Yet Cain delivered his own verdict. He needed to cut losses, and Michael was among them. He framed it as pragmatic, not personal, though it landed like a blade. Michael's response was quiet but steel-edged, promising that if forced to fight from the outside, he would do so with full force, because integrity was not something he would surrender. Not for Cain. Not for Victor, not for anyone. Cain nodded, telling him he expected nothing less. It was not reconciliation but recognition, the way adversaries sometimes look at each other across a line in the sand. Far from that tense conversation, at the Newman Ranch, Nikki poured herself another drink and told Victor she thought Cain was bluffing, puffing up his importance, exaggerating his power. But Victor was unconvinced. His instincts, honed from decades of ruthless gamesmanship, told him there was more beneath Cain's bravado. He suspected that Cain's dangerous momentum had roots in both personal vendettas and complicated ties, particularly the old entanglements with Jill Abbott and the ghosts of his own father. "Cain Ashby is making a grave mistake," Victor said flatly, the fire in his voice unmistakable. "He underestimates me, and he courts danger he cannot control." Nikki listened, unconvinced that Victor needed to step directly into this mess, but Victor thrived on battle, and Cain had just painted a target on his chest. The knock at the door broke the rhythm. Security reported an unexpected visitor, and Victor answered to find Jack Abbott on the threshold. Their rivalry was legendary, their battles spanning decades and empires, but Jack's expression carried not hostility but gravity. "We've been at war for longer than I can remember," Jack began, his voice low but steady. But the time has come to lower our swords. Victor's skepticism was immediate. Why now? Why peace when their feud had defined the city for so long? Jack laid it out plainly. Cain's rising empire threatened not just Newman, not just Jabot, but Chancellor itself. If they didn't form a united front, the younger man's ambition could dismantle everything they had fought to build. Victor resisted, as he always did, unwilling to let old grudges dissolve so quickly. But Jack pressed harder, revealing what he knew, that Cain's artificial intelligence program was not just a business project but a weapon. One that could unravel the foundations of their companies with speed and efficiency. The idea of technology replacing boardroom cunning was an insult to Victor's instincts, but Jack warned that Cain's reach could be devastating. "Why should I trust you?" Victor challenged, his eyes narrowing. Jack didn't flinch. "Because I know how to beat him at his own game. Together, the three of you as Jabot, Chancellor, Newman can crush him before he ever has a chance." Victor leaned back, weighing the irony of standing shoulder to shoulder with a man who had been his sworn enemy. Jack revealed his insight, that the key to Cain's obsession and his motives all tied back to Jill. It wasn't just about money or dominance, it was personal, wrapped in the complicated history that connected Jill to both Chancellor and Abbott legacies. If they wanted to stop him, they needed to strike there, to undermine his empire from its roots. Jack's voice was resolute, his strategy laid bare: infiltrate Cain's empire, sow weakness, and flip his power against him. Victor listened, silent, the chessboard forming in his mind. Nikki stood at the side, watching to Titan's weight in likeliest alliance. The question lingered heavy in the air: would Victor seize Jack's outstretched hand, choosing unity over enmity, or would he gamble that he could crush Cain alone? For a man who had spent a lifetime building power through isolation and dominance, the decision to collaborate would not come easily. But as the night deepened and the threats outside grew sharper, it was clear that Cain had forced a reckoning no one expected. In Genoa City, survival sometimes required enemies to become allies, and if Victor accepted Jack's plan, history itself would bend, rewriting the rules of war in the city forever.